for joining us, everybody. A warm welcome to you. My name is Jenny. I'm one of the co-CEOs of STIR Education. Just to reiterate what I've just said for the benefit of those who have just joined, that you'll have seen a poll pop up on your screen. Please do answer the poll, what is motivation? We'll be exploring that later in the session. Please feel free to put any questions or comments in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try and reflect on those as we go through the sessions. And feel free to continue the conversation on social media, #MotivationScience. A warm welcome. The theme of today's session is how can motivation science supercharge education systems in these very uncertain times. We are looking forward to sharing with you, Marco, we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. We're looking forward to, as part of today's session, sharing insights from our recent impact evaluation at STIR of our work in both Uganda and Indonesia. We're pleased to welcome Professor Nishith Prakash, who's our academic partner, who will also be sharing some insights on those evaluation results. We'll be given a brief interpretation of those findings and highlighting what we feel they tell us about the importance of motivation and motivation science in teaching and learning. And then the bulk of today will be our panel discussion, which promises to be really an insightful conversation with some amazing panelists, and we thank them all for joining us here today. A quick overview of STIR for those that might be newer to us. We're an international amplifying organisation that supercharges the impact of education interventions by supporting them to integrate the latest in motivation science. We've been around for over 10 years, working in this field, specifically applying those insights to education systems across 5 countries. And reaching around 12 million children across those countries. In terms of the impact evaluation, that is recent and it's focused on our work in Uganda and Indonesia. We've been in Uganda since 2014. It's our biggest country of operation. We currently work in 90% of districts at secondary and 50% of districts at primary. Reaching about 4.5 million students. In Indonesia, through our incubation partnership with YBPU, we've been working since 2022. So that is a newer area, newer country of work for us, and so younger. And we're currently working in 6 districts across 3 provinces in Indonesia, reaching around 350,000 students. In both those countries, we partner with central governments to deliver a system-wide approach to professional development. And our school-based teacher network meetings are anchored on the principles of intrinsic motivation, which is what we'll be focusing on today. And to tell you a bit more about the impact of that work, I'd like to hand over to Jobin Thomas, our Associate Director for Monitoring and Evaluation.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Hello, everyone. I hope I'm audible well, and thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm really excited to be presenting the findings of our impact evaluation study with you today. And with that, I'd like to also just point out that we'll not be sharing all the key findings, but only some of the very most critical findings from the study. So towards the end of this session, we will also be sharing with you the detailed reports so that you can access the entire study findings. With that, let me just give you an overview of the study first. So the study was conducted by Deloitte, so they were our implementation partner. And as Jenny mentioned, Professor Nishith supported us with technical review, and he'll also be speaking shortly after this session. The objective of the study was mainly to look at the impact of STIR on student learning outcomes and their social emotional learning. We also looked at intrinsic motivation among teachers and education officials, and also studied the education ecosystem in Uganda and Indonesia. We also looked at gender equity and value for money in the form of conducting a social return on investment analysis. Broadly, the approach that we employed is a mixed methods approach, which uses a treatment control comparison with qualitative assessment. I would also like to point out that while STIR has undertaken impact evaluation studies in the past, we've not quite invested much in measuring student level impact. And this study, more importantly, tries to address and fill that gap. So with that, let's just dive into the student learning outcomes that we have from the study. As you can see from this graph, we are seeing a positive impact on student learning outcomes because of our interventions in Indonesia and Uganda, both the countries, mainly in the range of 14 to 16%. What this means is that if students were a part of STIR program's intervention, then they were more likely to score higher, and the magnitude of this is between 14 to 16% in both Uganda and Indonesia. These results were statistically significant, which means that there is very less chance that this is the observed differences are by random chance. We also see a moderate impact on numeracy outcomes in Indonesia, as you can see in the graph, which shows a 4% improvement in numeracy outcomes. And this was not found to be statistically significant, which means that the difference could be by chance, and there is a need for further research to assess the impact of our interventions on numeracy outcomes in Indonesia. On the social emotional learning side, we are seeing that in Indonesia, students are seeking enhanced help-seeking behavior from students, peer support, and lower conflict escalation. And similarly, in Uganda, there is a stronger emotional intelligence displayed by students, empathy, and conflict resolution skills as well. Now, moving on to the impact on teachers and education officials. Overall, what we are seeing is that there is a stronger demonstration of intrinsic motivation among teachers, school leaders, and education officials. We are also seeing that this is through the modality of improved autonomy, peer collaboration, and engagement with program activities. Now, when we dig into the data more, some interesting patterns are starting to emerge, particularly around how different aspects of motivation play out in practice. Specifically, I would just want to highlight that at STIR, we see autonomy, mastery, and purpose rooted in the self-determination theory as the foundational drivers of intrinsic motivation. So as you can see in the slide and also in the figure adjacent to the content, the data is showing that when teachers say that they are motivated, it does not necessarily reflect in the learning outcomes of their students. Interestingly, the underlying drivers of motivation, which for us are autonomy, mastery, and purpose, do seem to be positively related with student learning outcomes. And not only these outcomes, but also the teacher behavior in the classroom. So why is this so interesting? So we feel that this is a very valuable insight. It is not just sufficient that teachers report or feel motivated, but do they actually experience the underlying drivers of motivation and how these drivers, how this drives their behavior in the classroom. And that's exactly what John will share with you shortly on why we need a deeper, more scientific understanding of motivation and what that looks like in practice. We also have learned in various areas for improvement in this study for both Uganda and Indonesia, and largely these are around improving program design, program implementation. Some of these are listed on the slide. For example, strengthening teacher-student support dynamics in the classrooms, improving the uptake of professional feedback practices. So while a program nudges professional feedback, we need to work more on how these are taken up in practice. We also need to work on deepening engagement of officials beyond facilitation. So with this, I conclude presenting the key insights from the study. We are also happy to share with you the detailed reports, the link to which my colleagues will share in the chat shortly. I hope you can review the report and reach out to us should you have any questions or need clarifications. With this, I would hand over to Professor Nishith to share his thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. And thanks, Jenny, for the introduction, and Jobin for doing this difficult task. So I'll keep myself like I won't go over the findings, but just give you the big picture. First of all, when Jobin asked me to be an external member, or whatever the title is, I think something that really brought me into this was the work that STIR is doing. So a few things to keep in mind. It's extremely hard to do a rigorous evaluation, especially ex post. And which means that STIR has to go back to the old style of doing research, which is not just collecting data, but thinking very carefully about how the program is implemented, and using those insights to come up with what would be the treatment group. And treatment group, basically, the best way to think about this, suppose you were starting a program in Uganda in 2010, and suppose the program was targeting grade 6 or grade 7 students in 2010. So the 6 and 7 students who were being targeted in 2010 would be considered as your treatment group, or the group that was impacted by the program. And the group that just missed it, which is grade 8 and above, they would be considered as the counterfactual. So that's kind of the style of evaluation that STIR has done. Second is, I want to point out, what do we know from the literature? So as you know, these outcomes, some of these outcomes people have studied for a long time, especially literacy, enrollment, dropout, attendance. So if you look at the education, people who work on education, many decades ago, people looked at literacy, then it moved to enrollment, people started looking at dropout, then it became attendance, then became test score, and now people are looking at, I don't know what's the right term, but basically I call it higher order human capital. So things about curiosity, creativity, socio-emotional skills, and so on. So what STIR has done, they have looked at the whole spectrum of outcomes, starting from literacy to socio-emotional skills. And I think it's really amazing that they have been able to do that. Something that I should point out, because I work in this area, I haven't written a paper that uses literacy as an outcome, but I have worked on paper which has looked at enrollment, attendance, socio-emotional skills, or these higher order human capital. It's really hard to move some of these outcomes. I think enrollment is probably one of the easiest to move, but as far as when it comes to attendance, test score, and socio-emotional, these are difficult outcomes to move. And what we see is a reflection of what people have found in the literature, that you see movements in literacy, large movements in literacy, you see some movements on other metrics, and small movements on test score. But these small movements in test score is not so far from the literature. So if there's a big literature on conditional cash transfer programs, all of these are very rigorously studied programs, and they have found these movements to be something between 0.4 to 0.8 standard deviation. So just to kind of wrap up, these results are encouraging. It seems like STIR was able to make an impact in these countries, and they have, I think what I liked was not just student outcomes, but looking at this more holistically, not just in terms of outcomes, but looking at various agents. So you can think about, when you think about education, you have children's, you have parents, you have teachers, and you have school administration. So I think STIR has, at least based on what they have done in these countries, they have tried to look at this more holistically. So I would encourage STIR to continue doing this rigorous work and probably think about more measures around the social emotional skills, because these are outcomes that's moving very fast. Means people have come up with very creative ways of measuring these things. So yeah, good work, and thank you for having me.
So thank you very much, Nishith, for that commentary, and thank you, Jobin, for sharing the overview of the results as well. I'm going to share a few reflections from our side on these results and what we think it means for us as an organisation. But just to tell you who I am before we do that, my name is John McIntosh. I am one of the co-CEOs alongside Jenny, based in the UK, and I've been working with STIR for about 7 years. So just to pick up on what Nishith was saying about the results. So I would say that we ultimately are really pleased with these results. The positive impact on foundational skills, which, as Nishith has pointed out, on the surface of it is quite modest, is bolstered, I think, by the cost effectiveness of the intervention and the scale at which it operates. So we think that this is a pretty representative sample of our work. We tried to make sure that was the case. And the scale we work at in Uganda and Indonesia is with over 100,000 teachers at an average cost of well under $1 per child. So in that context, we're very pleased with these results. But the question, I think, for us immediately becomes, what do we actually do next in order to build on all of this, and how do we maximize and further impact? And I think as an organization whose fundamental grounding concept is motivation, I think that the thing that really caught our attention were the findings around motivation. And as Jobin suggested, they were quite interesting and, in fact, somewhat counterintuitive. So on the one hand, we saw that there was no relationship between self-reported motivation and teaching and learning outcomes, but there was relationships between the predictors of motivation, i.e. a presence of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and those outcomes. So the question is, well, why does that matter, and what does it tell us? Well, a couple of just wider things from the wider literature on motivation. We think that this is reflective of a wider phenomenon in motivation research, where the concept itself is quite messy. It's just not very well defined as a term. And as a result, it means lots of different things to different people. So as you saw from the poll, the different options there are reflective of that, because in some ways, motivation is all of those things and it's more of them. But what that spawns is a lot of different theories that mean a lot of different things. And you can see there from the results that there's lots of different people who've seen different aspects to it as well. And I think that's why we continue to have arguments over the practicalities of some of this as well. Now, that isn't to say that the existing research that we have on motivation is wrong or not useful. It is. We know that from the work that we use mostly from a theory called self-determination theory, which says that we use the words autonomy, mastery, and purpose. It's got lots of evidence behind it as being a predictor of all sorts of positive behavioral outcomes and motivation. But what that theory and others in motivation are not good at is specifying what are the concrete specific things that we need to do to bring those things about. So in other words, they might tell us that autonomy or mastery or a sense of connection is good for motivation and positive behavior, but they don't really tell us very much about what should we do in practice to bring those things about. And I think that that's a real problem that we've got to address now more than ever. We all know that the sector the education sector globally is under more pressure than it's ever been. So I'm not going to labour that point. But I think what it means is we do have to find the most cost-effective, powerful levers for creating the conditions for people to thrive. And we think motivation science can be a really critical tool for helping us to do that. So Mark, if you can move to the next slide, thank you. So motivation science itself, it's an exciting emerging field, and there's already some really great academic and theoretical work going on. So the Co-Murayama's Motivation Science Lab at the University of Tübingen, Professor Shola's lab at the University of Virginia in the States. So we're very happy to signpost some of the interesting resources on this. But I think if we want to find out what are the most useful practical things that drive these things, we really do need more field-based work in real-world settings to identify them. And that's where I think in the education sector more broadly, we can make a real contribution here. So thinking about us as an organization and what all this means, well, I think firstly, we want to deepen our own learning about the most powerful practical mechanisms for driving motivation in our government partnerships in Indonesia and Uganda in the first instance. So as the study suggests, I think we have identified some practical things that are resulting in positive outcomes for stakeholders across an education system. And those mechanisms include things like peer observation and feedback, minimizing cognitive load and giving people time to make sense of new material, providing space and structure for teachers and others in the system to make the best decisions about how to integrate professional learning into their classrooms and district offices. But what we want to get more precise about is how to maximize those benefits for different groups under different conditions. So, for example, are there any differences in how mid-tier officials experience autonomy in a rural and urban setting in Indonesia? And what are the practical design tweaks that will reflect that? So the potential of the mechanisms that we've got is that we think we need to just go a little bit deeper to understand exactly how those play out on those different contexts and different conditions. And then I think the second thing that we want to do more of is to support other organizations to integrate some of the principles and insights from motivation science into their work in order to support them to maximize the potential of their people. And that involves adopting like a rapid scientific approach, working in partnership with others to help them work out in their context what are the most powerful practical mechanisms that can drive motivation. So we think the mechanisms that we've identified through our work can provide a really good starting point to create hypotheses and launching pads to learn from. But we know that those will need to be adapted and tweaked according to what we see working in practice across different contexts. So we've already been doing some of that work, supporting organizations in Ghana and Brazil, where we've been helping to redesign some teacher training programs, integrating some of these ideas and responding to what we find out, and also building staff capacity on the principles of motivation science, and also thinking about practical measurement indicators and things like that as well.